Ladies and gentlemen, another episode of Tosh Talks. I'm Tosh, and I am the main book buyer at Book Soup, an independent bookstore on Sunset Boulevard, on the Sunset Strip, in West Hollywood, which means Los Angeles, which means California, which means the United States of America. But, you know, we serve that area, including the United States, but we also serve the world. And I keep that in mind in my job. And tonight, that's a funny terminology, isn't it? Tonight? I said tonight, and yet you can see in the back of me it's still daylight. But it's all illusion, so don't worry about it. But tonight, we're going to focus on a writer by the name of Raymond Rousseau. And Raymond Rousseau is truly a unique figure in French literature. Well, beyond French literature, say world literature. He was a major inspiration for the Surrealists. He was a major inspiration for artists of the Dada and Surrealist period as well. There's the visual aspect of Surrealism, and there's the literature aspect of Surrealism. And Raymond Rousseau was highly influential in both aspects of the Surrealist motif, their art. Marcel Duchamp, the great artist Marcel Duchamp, was hugely influenced by Raymond Rousseau on numerous levels. And he may be the one person that got Duchamp to do his Duchamp thing. And what turned Marcel Duchamp onto Raymond Rousseau was that somewhere in the 20s, I believe, he went to a stage production called Impressions of Africa. Impressions of Africa was written by our hero of the day, Raymond Rousseau. And it has a strange history, Impressions of Africa. It started off as a long poem, which is called The New Impressions of Africa. And he worked on this book, Raymond Rousseau, for like 13 or 14 years. And one might ask, New Impressions of Africa sounds like a travel log of some sort, or it's about Africa. And exactly, that's not what it is. It's not about Africa. Impressions, perhaps, but the Africa that we know, even from the 1920s or the teens, is not the Africa that everybody else thinks they know. And Raymond Rousseau saw himself as being a great classic French writer. Not avant-garde at all, not modern at all, but something back to the classical era of literature, of French literature. Of course, he was totally wrong. Rousseau is a very interesting man in many ways because, as well as writing this impossible book, he was also extremely wealthy gentleman who could afford to pay for a publication of his books, to put out his literature out. His impression was at the time that when he would release this book, it would be a bestseller. He was thinking of himself in the same terminology as Zola or Balzac or these great French novelists, Hugo. But he's not. He's basically a weirdo. A very wealthy weirdo, a very eccentric weirdo, but nevertheless a weirdo who developed, I would say accidentally, but he enveloped a new literature of sorts for the 20th century. Often these things are mistakes, or people don't have the hindsight what they're doing, but Rousseau felt what he was doing was very important, but he just thought he was very conservative and it should be a bestseller book. So when he couldn't get a publisher, he was sort of an aesthetic person. He decided to publish the book himself so he can design the book himself. He was shocked when the book failed miserably. Not only did it not make the bestseller list at the time, but it also was a total failure in many ways. It seemed like the only people who liked the book were other weirdos, such as Marcel Duchamp, as Picasso, as Salvador Dali, as André Breton, and so forth. And they're the only ones who supported Raymond Rousseau, at least that was his public. Now, Rousseau wanted the masses When he does a reading, when he does an event, he sees millions of people out there. But all he got was Duchamp, Picasso, Breton, and Salvador Dali, and certain other Surrealist poets. Surrealist poetry and the poets of Surrealism always champion the loser or the outsider artist. Outsider artists are considered sort of losers, the beautiful losers of sorts, as terminology started recently, but people who operated outside the literary market or the art market. I mean, market meaning the financial world, the whole publisher-author relationship and readership issue. There are certain people who cannot participate in that world, so therefore, if they can, they make their own work, and hopefully something will happen with it. So Rousseau was, I don't know, he's probably worth millions at his time. In fact, Rousseau's an interesting guy. He never wore the same clothing twice. That's including suits. Of course, socks, underwear, gone the next day, but also suits. So whatever he wore that day, that was it. He got rid of, and he was quite a dandy. So that struck my interest right away. Also, he traveled around the world. In the 20s, he went totally around the world without leaving his cabin on the ship. He went to Africa. Did he go on Africa? Did he actually went on the continent of Africa? No. He was by the water of the coast of Africa, and he saw it through his window. And that is his impressions of Africa. And what's interesting about Rousseau is that he made up a whole artificial world. It's a world of his own making. And this poem he wrote that took 15 years for him to write. Can you imagine writing a poem for 15 years that nobody's going to read anyway? And to this day, nobody has really read. It's all punning. It's all puns, basically. Basically, he finds words that has double meaning or sounds like another word that you can misunderstood it being. You say something, you think it's something else. So he wrote a whole poem with that misunderstanding. And New Impressions of Africa is this book that he worked on for many years, 15, 16 years, whatever it was, to issue this complex work for the masses. And of course the masses didn't see it. He also had the book illustrated. And it's very interesting that he anonymously hired a detective agency to find this particular illustrator who illustrates like, like the Saturday Evening Post of its time, or whatever the French equivalent of Saturday Evening Post. So he found the most sort of mundane illustrator who had no artistic bent whatsoever, and he just gave him certain parts of the text anonymously, and the illustrator would just do the text. And the book is through that. You get like, again, you're not going to see things clearly, but these are sort of like illustrations, like a perfect example. So you got something, and the guy reads this crazy literature, and he just sort of did a version of it as an illustration. Almost like a newspaper. When something happened before photography, you drew it. You didn't photograph it, but you drew that. And the beauty of Raymond Rousseau is that he was, it makes perfect sense. It's very logical. It's like super logical. But you have to sort of know the code to understand it, so we can see code in those sorts. And people like Marcel Duchamp, who's totally code obsessed and secret language obsessed, Raymond Rousseau was his guy. Raymond Rousseau was a guy who narrated a story or a poem, but through a very coded sense. Now you're thinking, like, you're a reader, why do I have to go through all this trouble to understand Raymond Rousseau? Why should I even bother with this? Well, that's a good question. I mean, Rousseau inspired, again, all the isms of modern art. And it was a huge influence on the New York School of Poetry, like John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara. Those people love him. And I think because he, you write about poetry like I this, I feel bad, my baby left me, blah, 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 blah. Raymond Rousseau never wrote I in his work. It's basically all descriptive of things that happen that's quite remarkable and strange and very odd. And as a reader, you're not really fully understanding what's happening. But then you realize it's actually a pun. It's actually sort of a word within a word, or words play against each other. So in that sense, his poetry is very visual. And it's very visual, and it's almost reported as a fact. And there's a writer named Alain Robbe-Gurlet, who was part of the New Novel movement in France during the 60s and late 50s. And their type of writing, there's about 5 or 6 other authors besides Robbe-Gurlet. They wrote things very factual. It's almost like reading a reporter's notebook of the scene of a crime and stuff. And Rousseau sort of treated literature the same way, but he added a whole element of puns on top of it. And it's quite fascinating. Probably something, there's a new translation by Mark Ford, who actually wrote a really great biography on Raymond Rousseau about 8 years ago. I think it's still in print, but you should read that as well. And after Impressions, he wrote this book, which didn't work. Rousseau decided, what I'm going to do, I'll do a musical. Not a musical, a huge Broadway-like production of it. So he spent all his millions of dollars, or francs, millions of francs, old French money, and did a huge stage production. You know, dancers, cast of actors, you know, the whole sets, everything. He paid for everything. He paid for the theater, paid for the sets, paid for, you know, the costuming. You know, it cost like millions. And, you know, it was for the masses, because he only sees things for the masses. He didn't see things for just like 2 or 3 people. So he had this huge show, and who shows up? Marcel Duchamp, Salvador Dali, Andre Breton, Man Ray. What's the old line about the Velvet Underground, the band? 10 people bought that first album when it came out, but those 10 people started important bands like Roxy Music and, you know, and so on, and punk rock came from this album, but only 10 people originally bought it. So only 10 or 12 people actually saw Impressions of Africa, the stage version, as well as reading the book. But those 10 people are incredibly influential, and they actually changed the aesthetics of the 20th century and the 21st century like we never know it. Really briefly, this book, Locus Solus, is his, I think, his only narrative novel he wrote. And I'm using novel in a very loose term. It is a narrative. The story, if I can tell it in a sense, the story is about a man, a very rich collector, a professor, a collector, who is a scientist, a wealthy scientist, who has an island called Locus Solus. And on this island, he's giving a tour to a group of people who we don't know. We presume they're like fellow scientists or fellow scholars of some sort. And on this island, which he lives, he has weird collections of stuff and things. And you can read this book 500 times, you're never going to fully get everything, because it's so densely text. I mean, the text is actually very simple, but the visuals of it is so intense. I never read a more intense book than this. It's almost like I have to read every 3 pages, I have to put it down, because I have to think about what he wrote. Not really think, but just get the visual picture. Like, for instance, he shows his fellow scientists, or whoever they are, they're sort of anonymous people, this diamond, big diamond, and this diamond is full of water. And in this water, there's a dancer, a female dancer. I think she's naked, can't remember. Sexy image. And in this, with this pool, this water, is a skinless cat, a cat with no fur, and the head of Danton. Danton was a politician figure of the French Revolution. And when he got when he got guillotined, they saved the head, or he stole the head, and this main collector got it as a collection, the head of Danton, and he preserved Danton's head by attaching electricity sockets to shock it open to keep the brain going, and he put this in the pool of water, which is in the shape of a diamond, and somehow he invented water, which will it's like oxygen, so people can breathe underwater, and that's all you get is a whole description of this whole thing. So anyway, this is the world of Raymond Rousseau. Totally insane person. I really, really strongly recommend, if you're into poetry, into 20th century arts or aesthetics, you have to get into him. And it's not always the easiest thing to get into, but once you get there, you're going to have an incredible ride. It's really amazing. Thank you. Tosh talks.